The afternoon sun was trying to peek through the dusty windows of the community hall, but it couldn't quite brighten the mood. John, a retired Navy SEAL, stood by the back wall, his arms crossed, watching the usual town meeting unfold. He wasn't really paying attention to the chatter about the new park regulations until a familiar voice cut through the air. It was Mark, a man John once considered a brother in arms, now a local figurehead, standing at the podium. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, stood nervously in front of Mark, his face red and swollen, a fresh bruise blooming on his cheekbone. He was trying to explain how a group of older kids had pushed him around, taken his lunch money, and called him names. The boy's voice was small, shaky, and full of fear. John felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a reaction that years of combat training had never quite erased when he saw injustice. Mark, however, just chuckled. It wasn't a mean chuckle, but a dismissive one, the kind that made you feel like your problems were trivial. "Boys will be boys, son," Mark said, leaning into the microphone, his voice echoing slightly. "You gotta toughen up. Can't let a few bumps and scrapes get you down. Happens to everyone." He even winked at some of the adults in the front row, who offered weak smiles in return. "Maybe you just need to stand your ground a bit more, eh? Show 'em you're not an easy target." John felt something cold settle deep inside him. He looked at Mark, this man he'd trusted with his life, who was now publicly dismissing a child's pain, essentially telling him it was his fault for being a victim. It wasn't just indifference. It felt like an endorsement, a subtle nod to the bullies that their actions were acceptable, even expected. The boy's eyes, already wet, filled with fresh tears, and he looked down at his scuffed shoes, utterly defeated. Instead of yelling or even stepping forward, John's gaze just hardened. It was a slow, quiet change, a deep resolve setting in. He didn't interrupt Mark's rambling advice about character building and learning life's hard knocks. He simply waited. When the boy was finally ushered off the stage, his shoulders slumped, John moved. He walked past a few whispering townsfolk and bent down slightly, catching the boy's eye. Without a word, John gently squeezed the boy's shoulder, a firm, reassuring touch. It was a silent promise, a message that someone saw him, someone believed him, and someone would protect him. Behind them, the bullies, who had been lingering near the door, snickered. They thought they had won, emboldened by Mark's words. But as John's hand rested on the boy's shoulder, a chilling sense of something else, something much bigger than their petty cruelty, seemed to hang in the air. Their victory felt short-lived, shadowed by John's quiet presence. Some battles are fought not with fists, but with unwavering principle. John stood up, not looking at Mark, but his eyes swept over the room, meeting the gazes of a few people who quickly looked away. Then he turned and walked out of the hall, the sound of his boots on the old wooden floor surprisingly loud in the sudden quiet. He left Mark there, still at the podium, still talking, but John's departure had stolen some of the air from the room. The boy's tear-streaked face was etched in John's memory, a vivid reminder of what he had just witnessed. The audience was left to wonder what John's calculated response would entail, and what kind of reckoning was coming. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. John's footsteps led him out into the crisp evening air, away from the stifling community hall and Mark's empty words. This small town, nestled deep in rural America, was supposed to be his haven. It was a place where life moved a little slower, where neighbors knew each other by name, and where traditional values were supposed to hold firm. He had returned here seeking peace after years of service, after seeing things that no man should ever have to see. His home, a modest, well-maintained house on the outskirts, spoke of his disciplined nature, a stark contrast to the chaos he'd left behind. He kept a quiet routine, early morning runs before the sun was fully up, meticulous care of his small garden, and long evenings spent in quiet reflection, often with a book, or just the silence for company. The town itself thrived on shared events, like the annual Harvest Festival, Friday night football games, and potluck dinners at the church. There was a strong sense of local identity, a pride in their history and their way of life. People helped each other out, whether it was fixing a leaky roof or bringing a meal to a sick neighbor. But beneath this surface of harmony, John had slowly started to notice something else. There were unspoken hierarchies, certain families whose opinions carried more weight, and a quiet resistance to anything that might disrupt the established order. It was a place that valued comfort over confrontation, sometimes to its detriment. John was somewhat of a solitary figure, respected for his military service, but also a little distant. He had a few trusted friends from his military past, men who understood the things he couldn't talk about, but he largely kept to himself. His solitude wasn't loneliness, it was a chosen path, a way to process the silent scars of war. He carried a deep-seated need for justice, a yearning for a peaceful life where the innocent were truly protected, not just in theory, but in practice. He often dreamt of a community where integrity still held sway, where doing the right thing wasn't a choice, but a given. Mark, the man who had just brushed off a child's pain, had once been a different person. He was a respected figure, a symbol of strength and camaraderie during their shared time in the service. John remembered Mark as someone who could always be counted on, a leader who inspired confidence. Their shared past had forged a bond that John had believed was unbreakable, something that transcended the normal friendships. To see Mark now, so changed, so casual with injustice, was a profound disappointment. It wasn't just a betrayal of their past, it was a betrayal of the very ideals they had fought for. John's moral compass had always been unyielding. His experiences with injustice, both in combat and in observing the world, had sharpened his senses. He had seen what happens when good people do nothing, when the vulnerable are left exposed. That's why his reaction to the bullying, and especially to Mark's indifference, was so visceral. It wasn't just about a boy and his bullies. It was about the fundamental values of right and wrong, about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. The ache in his chest wasn't just anger. It was a deep sorrow for what Mark had become, and for the community that tacitly allowed it. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. John tried to piece together when Mark had started to change, when the cracks in his character first began to show. It wasn't a sudden break, but more like a slow erosion, a subtle shift that, in hindsight, was clear as day. He remembered a time during their deployment, a critical mission where Mark, despite being in charge, had made a call that put their unit at unnecessary risk. He'd brushed it off later, as a judgment call, but John had seen the fear in the eyes of their men, the way Mark had prioritized looking good to a superior officer over the safety of his team. It was a small thing then, easily forgotten in the chaos, but looking back, it was a clear sign of his self-interest creeping in. Then there were the broken promises. After they'd both left the service, Mark had sworn he'd help John set up his small veterans support group, offering his community connections. But when the time came, Mark was always too busy, always had a more important meeting. He'd offer vague apologies and empty assurances, always with that charming smile that made it hard to stay angry. John had seen it happen to others too. Promises of help for local projects or small businesses, only for Mark to vanish when actual effort was required. These weren't grand betrayals, but they chipped away at the trust John had in him, showing a pattern of prioritizing his own convenience over his word. There were also the veiled humiliations. John recalled a town hall meeting a few years back, discussing a new zoning proposal. John had voiced a concern, a valid point about the impact on a working-class neighborhood. Mark, who was already on the town council, had subtly dismissed John's input, making a joke about military men and their rigid rules, earning a few laughs from the room. It wasn't direct, but it was enough to make John feel small, to make his valid point seem like an overreaction. Mark was good at that, using his influence and charm to belittle anyone who challenged him, always with a veneer of good humor. The manipulation was even more unsettling. John remembered a local election for a school board position. Mark had publicly endorsed one candidate, a friend of his, while quietly spreading rumors about the other, a dedicated but less connected teacher. He never said anything outright malicious, but the whispers he started, the questions he subtly raised, were enough to sway opinion. The teacher lost, and Mark's friend won, giving him more leverage within the town's institutions. It was a masterful display of indirect control, always keeping his hands clean, while achieving his desired outcome. And then came the moments of injustice, where Mark actively turned a blind eye, or even participated in covering up inconvenient truths. There was the time when discrepancies were found in the community fund for the annual fair. John knew Mark, as treasurer, had a hand in it, but Mark skillfully deflected blame, pointing fingers at a low-level volunteer. The issue was quickly swept under the rug, the volunteer quietly fired, and Mark's reputation remained untouched. He always prioritized his image, his standing, over ethical conduct. These accumulated betrayals, these moral compromises, had slowly but surely revealed Mark's true character. His dismissal of the bullied boy wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a deeply ingrained flaw. It was the last straw for John, the final shattering of his respect for Mark and his belief in Mark's integrity. John had seen enough. The man he once considered a brother in arms was gone, replaced by someone he barely recognized, someone who needed to be stopped. Following that incident, a heavy, almost suffocating tension settled over the town, especially between John and Mark. It was the kind of quiet unease that everyone felt, but nobody talked about openly. The community, without officially taking sides, became implicitly divided. People sensed an unspoken conflict brewing, a storm gathering beneath the surface of their small-town peace. Subtle clashes started to pop up between John and Mark. It wasn't direct yelling or fighting, but more like passive-aggressive moves and public shows of disapproval. If John walked into the local diner, Mark's usual crowd might suddenly get quiet or turn their backs slightly. On the other hand, those who respected John's integrity, often the quieter folks who'd seen Mark's true colors before, offered him small nods of solidarity, a shared glance of understanding. It was a silent war, fought with looks and unspoken judgments. Whispers and gossip spread through the town like wildfire. The incident with the bullied boy became the main topic at the grocery store, at church gatherings, and over coffee. People started taking sides. Some defended Mark, saying he was just trying to keep the peace, or that John was overreacting. Others, however, questioned Mark's actions, finally daring to voice their concerns about his moral compass. The moral implications of Mark's dismissal and John's quiet but firm defiance were dissected and debated in hushed tones. John felt the increasing weight of social pressure. Neighbors, even some distant relatives, started quizzing him. "Are you sure you want to stir things up, John?" they'd ask. Or, "Maybe it's best to just let it go for the sake of community harmony." They meant well, or at least they thought they did, but their words felt like tiny weights pushing him down. He understood their desire for peace, but he couldn't shake the feeling that peace at the cost of justice wasn't real peace at all. Mark, meanwhile, seemed to thrive on the challenge. Instead of backing down, he became even more arrogant and dismissive. He'd publicly exaggerate his good deeds, talking loudly about his charity work or how much he'd done for the town. At the same time, he started subtly slandering John's character. He'd drop hints about John being overly sensitive since his military service, or suggest he was a troubled veteran who saw problems where none existed. He used his influence to further isolate John, making it clear that if you were with John, you were against Mark, and by extension, against the established order. This period was incredibly tough for John. He felt an intense emotional pressure, a deep sense of isolation. The town, which he had returned to for peace, now felt like a cage. He was frustrated by the complacency, the way people just accepted Mark's behavior. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash, knowing he had to do something, but feeling the immense inertia of a whole community. This was the peak of his internal struggle. He felt the heavy weight of the injustice, not just for the boy, but for all the times Mark had gotten away with it. He also felt the responsibility to protect the vulnerable, a duty that had been ingrained in him during his SEAL days. He knew, deep down, that he couldn't let this go. The quiet unease had turned into a burning conviction. He had to act. The question was no longer if, but how. The answer to how came sooner than John expected, and it wasn't what he thought it would be. It began with some quiet digging, a few conversations with people who had always been a little too scared to speak up about Mark. What John uncovered wasn't just indifference or a lack of empathy. It was something far more sinister. He found irrefutable evidence of Mark's direct involvement in a scheme that had been financially exploiting vulnerable members of the community. This wasn't just about the bullied boy. It was about the boy's family, specifically his grandmother, who had been struggling with medical bills. Mark, using his position and influence, had set up a predatory loan program disguised as a community support initiative, targeting those in desperate situations. He'd then buy up their debts for pennies on the dollar, effectively seizing their property or assets when they inevitably defaulted. This went beyond mere oversight or turning a blind eye. It revealed active, calculated malice. John stared at the documents, the bank statements, the signed contracts, a cold anger settling in his gut. This wasn't just about a schoolyard bully. It was about a systematic dismantling of people's lives for profit. He saw names he recognized, faces from around town, people who had always trusted Mark. His decision was made then and there. Silence was no longer an option. His military training, his moral code, every fiber of his being demanded action. He wasn't doing this for revenge, but for justice, for the quiet dignity of those Mark had trampled underfoot. He decided he would expose Mark, no matter the cost. Mark, meanwhile, was feeling the pressure. He wasn't stupid. He sensed John's growing determination, the way John carried himself, the subtle shift in the town's atmosphere. He knew John was a threat to his carefully constructed image. In a desperate, extreme move, Mark decided to double down. He started actively fabricating a story about John's instability, spreading rumors that John's time in the military had left him mentally unbalanced, prone to delusions, and even dangerous. He tried to paint John as a troubled veteran who was lashing out, a danger to the community. He told people John was paranoid, that he saw conspiracies everywhere, anything to discredit him before John could strike. Mark even went as far as planting stories with a few local gossip columnists, hinting at John's supposed erratic behavior. Then, an unexpected opportunity landed on John's doorstep. A local investigative journalist, a sharp woman named Sarah who had recently moved to town, had started hearing whispers, not about John's alleged instability, but about Mark's dubious dealings. Sarah had a keen eye for hypocrisy and a nose for corruption. She had been quietly digging into some of the town's financial anomalies, and Mark's name kept coming up. She approached John cautiously. Having heard about his quiet defiance at the school, she offered him a platform, a legitimate and powerful avenue to expose the truth. She explained she wasn't interested in gossip, only facts, and if he had evidence, she would present it fairly. This moment, this convergence of events, was the turning point. The devastating revelation of Mark's predatory scheme, John's resolute decision to act, Mark's desperate and unethical attempt to discredit him, and then this unexpected hand from a journalist. It all shattered the suffocating status quo. It was the moment John moved from passive observation, from internal struggle, to active intervention. The narrative shifted dramatically, from one of quiet suffering and simmering injustice to the undeniable pursuit of truth and accountability. The fight was no longer just John's. It was about to become public, and the town was about to see its true colors revealed. John found himself in a whirlwind of emotions. Doubt gnawed at him, a cold knot in his stomach. What if he was wrong? What if Mark managed to twist things so John looked like the villain? The repercussions weighed heavily. He worried about his reputation, the quiet life he had built, even his safety. Exposing a man like Mark, a man with power and connections, was not a small thing. He knew he could lose his standing in the community, the respect he had earned. The personal cost of this decision felt immense, a heavy burden on his shoulders. He lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, the faces of the exploited families flashing in his mind. He knew this was the right path, but the path itself was terrifying. But as the pressure mounted, allies began to emerge, slowly at first, then with increasing strength. The bullied boy's family, initially hesitant and afraid, found courage in John's stand. They came forward with their own stories, quiet testimonies of Mark's predatory financial tactics, of promises broken and savings lost. Their voices, once silenced by fear, now joined a growing chorus. From his military past, a few trusted friends reached out. They were men who understood loyalty and justice. They didn't question John's motives. They offered unwavering support, practical advice, and a listening ear. They were a solid rock in the shifting sands of public opinion. Sarah, the investigative journalist, proved to be an invaluable ally. She worked tirelessly, meticulously verifying every claim, cross-referencing documents, and conducting discreet interviews. Her professionalism and dedication were a powerful force, lending credibility to John's difficult truth. On the other side, Mark's network of powerful local figures and cronies rallied to his defense, or at least to protect their own interests. They actively worked to discredit John, spreading rumors about his mental state, whispering about his past, trying to paint him as unhinged. They attempted to obstruct Sarah's investigation, using their influence to close doors and intimidate potential witnesses. Some community members, swayed by Mark's long-standing influence and fear of reprisal, ostracized John. He felt cold stares in the grocery store, heard whispers when he walked down the street. His daily life became a challenge, a constant reminder of the division he had sparked. The small-town culture, with its deep-rooted emphasis on keeping the peace, and its initial reluctance to challenge authority, made things harder. People valued harmony, even if it meant overlooking uncomfortable truths. There was a fear of ostracism, a desire to avoid rocking the boat. However, beneath this surface, the American value of justice, the belief in protecting the innocent, slowly began to shift public opinion. As Sarah's quiet investigation unearthed more facts, as the bullied boy's family and others bravely shared their stories, the narrative began to turn. The profound psychological impact on John was immense. He experienced sleepless nights, his senses heightened, always vigilant. The weight of responsibility was immense, but it also solidified his resolve. He knew he was fighting for something bigger than himself, for the vulnerable, for the core principles he believed in. He faced public scrutiny, yes, but he also found an unexpected strength in the growing support of those he was protecting. He realized that sometimes, to do what was right, you had to be willing to stand alone, even if it meant facing down an entire town. The emotional toll was heavy, but the certainty in his purpose was heavier still. With the tide slowly turning, John began the difficult process of rebuilding, not just his own life, but also helping to mend the fractured community. The isolation he had felt started to recede, replaced by a growing wave of support. Neighbors, who had once averted their gaze, now offered hesitant smiles, then open conversations. The bullied boy's family, now free from Mark's financial grip, became his staunchest advocates, their gratitude palpable. John found solace in helping them navigate the complexities of retrieving their lost savings, guiding them through paperwork, and connecting them with legal aid. He dedicated himself to assisting other victims of Mark's schemes, becoming a quiet, steadfast presence for those who had been too afraid to speak out before. He wasn't seeking praise, just trying to make things right. The investigative journalist, Sarah, finally published her exposé. It was a searing, meticulously researched piece that laid bare Mark's years of deception, financial exploitation, and abuse of power. It wasn't just about the bullied boy. It detailed a pattern of predatory behavior that stretched back years, affecting dozens of families. The article, published in a regional newspaper and quickly picked up by online news outlets, sent shockwaves through the small town and beyond. Mark's carefully constructed facade crumbled instantly. The evidence John had provided, coupled with the testimonies of his victims and Sarah's relentless digging, was irrefutable. The public outcry was immediate and fierce. Legal proceedings followed swiftly. Mark, stripped of his influence and exposed for the fraud he was, faced charges related to embezzlement and financial misconduct. He lost his positions on the town council and various local boards. His business, once a pillar of the community, was investigated and eventually dissolved. His reputation, once sterling, was irrevocably shattered, replaced by public scorn and contempt. The man who had once commanded respect and fear now stood alone, facing the full weight of his transgressions. His network of cronies, realizing their own complicity could be exposed, quickly distanced themselves, leaving him isolated and without allies. The resolution, while satisfying, was also realistic. Mark was held accountable, not through John's personal vendetta, but through the due process of law and the power of truth. He didn't vanish into thin air. but he faced consequences that were proportional to his crimes, consequences that would forever alter his life and standing. The bullied boy and his family received restitution, a significant portion of their stolen funds recovered, and with it, a sense of closure. The town, shaken to its core, began a slow, painful process of healing. It was forced to confront its own complacency, its willingness to overlook wrongdoing for the sake of peace. Trust had to be rebuilt, not just in its leadership, but in each other. New, more transparent systems were put in place to prevent such abuses from happening again. John, though scarred by the experience, found a renewed sense of purpose. He realized that true heroism wasn't just about fighting on battlefields far away, but about standing up for justice in one's own community, in the quiet, often messy, everyday battles. He continued his early morning runs, but now with a lighter step. He still kept to himself mostly, but his solitude was no longer one of silent suffering, but of quiet peace. He had fulfilled his moral obligation. He had made a tangible difference in the lives of the vulnerable, proving that even in a small town, one person's unwavering principle could enact profound change. The small town learned a difficult but essential lesson about integrity, and John, the ex-Navy SEAL, finally found the peace he had sought, knowing he had truly protected the innocent